Hi, everybody. Welcome back, or welcome to, since this is the very first chapter and the very first section for Honors U.S. History 10. Today, we're going to be looking at our very first set of notes. And if you're in class, I'll also kind of be going over how the whole note taking process works. For purposes of this video, I will not be doing that, but feel free to let me know if you have questions about the whole note taking process. But it pretty much just goes like an outline. I think you'll figure it out as we go. So when we talk about American history, I know some of the things, the sort of images that probably come into our minds are things like the American colonies or the American Revolution and people like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and some others. But we, of course, are going to start much further back than that. And we are going to spend just a little bit of time here at the beginning talking a little bit about American history prior to the arrival of Europeans. Of course, we know that it isn't true, but we also know that there was the conception for quite a long time that America had no history before the arrival of Europeans, that this was just a vast open nothingness. The assignments or the reading that you did, hopefully in your summer assignment, talked about Europeans seeing this continent as a vast wilderness, seeing it as a new world, when in fact it had been populated, it had been settled, and was being utilized by many complex societies for thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. And while they were quite different from Europeans, it certainly did not make them primitive. It certainly didn't make them savage or without culture. They were very, very complex. And so we're going to do a little bit of looking at some of these groups, just some very general characteristics of them. You could study years on these people. And also when it comes to Native Americans and Native American societies, pre-Columbian societies is what we call this, meaning that we're talking about prior to 1492, prior to the arrival of Europeans. Is there so much that we don't know? In fact, we really don't know what we don't know, because most of these groups, or hardly any of them, utilized written language. So we don't have a written record of these people, and people that may have been long gone but by the time that Europeans arrived. Furthermore, once Europeans arrive, large numbers of these people will be dying out, either from disease or from warfare or being enslaved, their cultures being destroyed. So there's so much that we just, again, do not know. And so we're making a lot of generalizations and a lot of assumptions here. But one thing that we can certainly say, and that we have to get out of our heads as far as Native Americans are concerned, is that they're not all just one. It's not just one culture. It is thousands of cultures. We tend to group them all together, even if we, realize and we do understand that Native Americans had sophisticated culture and that they were, a dynamic people. We tend to group them all together. We tend to just look at them all the same way, and think of them as being just, identifying all together as one group, as one people. But this was an incredibly diverse societies, that were there were thousands of cultures speaking different languages, practicing different religions. They didn't always get along. They warred with each other. They traded with each other. It was complicated and it was complex. And that's something that Europeans didn't realize and failed to see, and just tended to group them all together. But let's start by going back a little bit further even than that. Let's talk for just a few minutes about the very, very first Native Americans, before we even get settled societies that we can really identify, and put a name to, and talk a little bit about specific cultures, about the arrival of some of the first people onto the American continents, both North, Central, and South America. Sort of the overall general understanding and widely accepted belief about how the first people came to the Americas, how they came to live here, was that they migrated over time across a land bridge, that many thousands of years ago, when the world was a lot colder, that people slowly but surely started to migrate across a land bridge. And you probably have heard of the proper name for that land bridge, the Bering Strait. And that back when the world was a lot colder, and this would have been, again, thousands of years ago, there's a debate about exactly when this started to happen, but somewhere probably between about 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, so long time, people slowly but surely started to migrate across this land bridge made of ice. And this land bridge would have existed between Asia and North America, what we would today know of as Alaska or parts of Canada or even the Arctic. And that people slowly but surely over time start migrating across this land bridge and eventually trickling down into the Americas. Some of the things that we can deduce about some of these earliest people, and also explaining why they were traveling across that land bridge, is that they were nomadic. These people were pretty much all nomads. And this land bridge soon becomes this crossroads from people, or this continent will soon eventually become a crossroads for all kinds of people with new cultures coming to the continent. But before that, mostly nomadic cultures that didn't stay in one place for too long. As I'm sure you know, nomad means that they travel a lot, that they're not staying in one place, that they move from place to place. And the reason for that is because these people are hunters and gatherers. They're hunting and gathering their food. They're not farming their food. And so they're going to move when the food moves. They're going to follow the herds when they go to different places or when they've been overhunted. They are going to gather naturally growing berries and things like that. When the seasons change, when the climate changes and so forth, people are going to move with them. So that's why they're not staying in any one place for too long. So if these groups then are hunting and gathering, they're nomadic, that means they're not staying in any one place. So they're not in any place long enough to really put down permanent roots and build complex structures. So they tend to live in more scattered villages, in makeshift huts and tents and things that could easily be packed up and moved somewhere else. So we don't see the opportunity for a lot of these groups to start congregating into larger cities or anything like that. So these people obviously are not farming. So that is the big game changer. That is what allows progression to take place, something called the agricultural revolution, which simply means the beginning of agriculture, the beginnings of farming, when human beings start learning to farm and cultivate their own crops, when they develop the techniques and the technology to start farming. And this doesn't start in the Americas. It actually starts in the Middle East thousands and thousands of years ago. We're not exactly sure when, but eventually human beings start to farm. And it really actually only represents a small portion of human existence that we've actually been farming. But what this means is, not only does this mean another way to find food, this means that people can stay in one place. This means that people can settle down. It means that they can cease, and not all of them will, of course, but they can cease that nomadic way of life, settle down in one place, and therefore start developing more complex cultures, start building, more permanent homes, more permanent structures. And eventually some of those small groups will turn into larger groups, and scattered villages might become more, larger villages, even cities and even mighty empires developing from that. So the importance of agriculture can't be overstated. We think of it as being simple and basic and ancient, and in a lot of ways it is, but it also is a huge game changer in the course of human development, meaning that people could stay in one place and therefore develop more complex cultures. So cultures and of more complex nature, more populated cities and things like that start to develop in the Americas thousands and thousands of years ago. We believe some of the first ones probably in Central America. We're going to focus for the next couple minutes mostly on North America, since that's going to be, of course, the focus of our course this year. We want to take a few minutes to talk about some of these diverse societies that developed in mostly North America, although I will spend a short period of time on some of the ones in Central America. And we're not looking really at specific tribes or specific cultures, just we're looking at this geographically. So keep in mind that even still, we are talking within each of these little subsections about thousands of people. We don't even know how many. Lots of different groups that are not all the same. So we are still very much overgeneralizing here. But again, the purpose here is to understand. And one of the things that we have to understand is that these are diverse groups of people. There are lots of different societies, lots of different cultures that were very different from each other, and that they were different based on a lot of different things. But a lot of that goes to their environment. We're going to see here that the environment very much shaped these cultures, and they adapt to their environment, and their cultures develop in large part based on the environment in which they live. So we're going to start, again, we're looking at these each kind of geographically, starting with Native Americans in the Arctic region, which is, of course, right up here, which I'm sure you know is quite cold, very, very frigid temperatures. And therefore, Native American groups in the Arctic region don't do a lot of agriculture or hardly any agriculture at all, because crops simply won't grow in the ice and the snow. So here you're talking about mostly hunters and gatherers, small fishing villages where they would fish through the ice, eating sea animals like seals, but also using them for other purposes, clothing and things like that. So smaller societies, smaller villages, where agriculture was not really a part of what they did, again, because of that environment. Looking then at the plains, the Great Plains area, and oftentimes these groups, although this is technically not a very correct term now, the Plains Indians or Native Americans in this area right here in the Central Plains region. Here, you're talking about land that is still rather dry, rather arid. And so these are mostly nomadic groups. And when we think about what is sometimes an iconic or perhaps stereotypical is a better word for it, image of Native Americans on horseback hunting buffalo, that sort of thing, that's what you would have here. That was true of Native Americans in the Great Plains region. Some agriculture, but not very much, or not as much, rather, as we're going to see in some other places, because this area was rather dry and arid, and it is suitable for agriculture, but not without more modern technologies that weren't available in the pre-Columbian times. So these are more smaller groups, kinship groups, again, mostly nomadic, especially after the arrival of Europeans, who will then introduce horses to Native Americans, hunting bison, buffalo, that sort of thing. That's what you would see in this general area. So once again, the difficulty of agriculture and the wide open spaces and the buffalo and such that were naturally there give rise to these cultures developing the ways that they did. Third, looking at the Great Lakes region, or rather this map labels it as the Northeast, this group right in here. Lots of different diverse groups here. In the Great Lakes region, you would see a great deal of agriculture. This land is far more suited to agriculture. And agriculture is common amongst a lot of Native American groups, particularly, of course, corn is a major crop of Native Americans, or as it is often called, maize, but also beans and squash. Those three often referred to as the three sisters, as kind of three major staple Native American grown crops. It's common amongst a lot of different Native American groups from North to South America. So those kinds of crops are what you'll see grown there. Also, in this area, you have a lot of dense forests, a lot of timber, and therefore it was common for a lot of Native Americans, particularly groups like the Iroquois, to live in these what they called long houses or plank houses that were made of wood, so utilizing the timber in their area for their living spaces. And these groups lived in pretty complex societies in both small and large villages, and some of these groups becoming quite large, quite powerful, and even forming confederations, alliances with even quite to even some of the English settlers, what seems like pretty sophisticated government by the time of the arrival of the Europeans. The Northwest, moving over to this area, some of this moving up into the Arctic, but also along what would today be the western coast of Canada, the western coast of the United States, and Washington State, and all of that. Here, because you'll notice the prevalence of water, these are people who are living right on the Pacific coast, and there's a lot of intercoastal waterways and rivers around this area as well. And so these are mostly fishing communities also. These Native Americans do have some farming and some agriculture, but fishing villages is a lot of what you'll see. Fishing salmon and other kinds of life that you would find in the rivers and waterways of those areas would have been prominent for those particular Native Americans. So those fishing villages and trading, other things, a lot of regional trade networks up and down the West Coast here for these Native Americans. So they are quite complex in that way as well, and that they do have contact and are trading with each other quite often as well. The Southwest, so looking at right in this region here and also overlapping into what this map labels as the Great Basin. In the Southwest, you see, because this is are areas that can be very, very dry and arid. Think of them as, we sometimes have images of these places being rather desert-like. Here is where you would find a lot of our groups known as the Pueblos or Pueblo people. You may have seen pictures like this one, images like this one, of Pueblo houses, these cliff dwellings that a lot of these groups would carve out of the landscape to provide shelter from the heat and places to live. Almost these whole cities are apartment-like dwellings, clay houses, utilizing a lot of that dry soil, again, using their environment, adapting to their environment, using that for their housing, but also for pottery and things like that that they crafted and used and traded and things along those lines. There was no agriculture here. These people did develop irrigation systems, ways to irrigate their crops, and growing some of those same things, the three sisters, your squash and corn and beans and all those sorts of things. In the southeast, moving over to our neck of the woods, or the Mississippi River Valley region, because the Mississippi River Valley area and all this land in the southeast, as we know, is very, very well suited to farming. A lot of these Native Americans were farmers, were agriculturalists, living in settled communities and settled villages because of the rich soil, able to grow some of those similar crops. So some of these were larger than others. In fact, one of what we believe the largest of Native American civilizations in North America, it was long since gone by the time of the arrival of Europeans, but we believe that was in this area, probably somewhere around, I'm wanting to say, the St. Louis area. But this would include Native American tribes that you probably have heard of, like the Creeks and the Cherokee, some of those that are actually still around, maybe not necessarily located around here anymore, but those that have connections to our neck of the woods. So settled communities, agriculture, as well as hunting, of course, and utilizing, once again, their environment. Now, in Central America, which isn't quite shown on this map, moving further down into present-day Mexico and present-day Central and South America. It is in Central America that we see by far the largest of Native American civilizations. This is where we will see incredibly powerful groups develop. Groups like, for example, the Mayans, which had reached their peak and long since died out by the time that Europeans arrived. But groups like the Mayans spread out over what is today Mexico, built incredibly complex cities with large pyramids, some of those ruins still standing today, had incredibly complex culture, developed a system of writing, an accurate calendar. Their cities had hospitals, their cities had schools, they studied astronomy, very, very sophisticated culture in a very, very early time. The Mayans are quite ancient. Like I said, they were around well before the arrival of Europeans, and all their cities were mysteriously abandoned well before the arrival of Europeans. But a lot of the things that they did, like developing a system of writing, like discovering or utilizing certain mathematical concepts, they did that before Europeans did. So while Europeans come in oftentimes, all the time, really assuming themselves to be superior and smarter and more advanced and those kind of things, in some cases, evidence directly contradicts that. You also have groups like the Aztecs. We'll talk about the Aztecs a little bit later because they were the largest and most powerful at the time when Europeans arrived. The Aztecs created a massive military empire throughout Central America, were incredibly wealthy, huge cities. In fact, their capital city was larger than any European city at the time. So when the Spanish arrive and see their capital city, which was called Tenochtitlan, or that's pronounced different ways by different people, it's larger than Milan, it's larger than Paris, it's larger than London. All those were very, large European cities, but here we had a Native American city built like in the middle of a big lake with irrigation, with temples, with gold, with, complex structure. So these were quite, sophisticated people and quite diverse ones. And they're also going to have, of course, a lot of things of great value that Europeans would be very, very enticed and intrigued by. And this map here just once again shows you sort of a recap of some of the different things that you saw happening amongst Native American environments or amongst Native American societies. Again, you can see the diversity, but also the ways in which these groups are utilizing their environments and adapting to their environments, and that really shapes their culture. So again, there's so much that we just don't know because few of these groups left behind any kind of written record, because so many of them are going to be dying out as soon as Europeans arrived or had died out before Europeans arrived. It's very difficult to really know a whole lot of specifics about pre-Columbian culture. So some of it remains very, very much a mystery. Um, so we will continue to look at Native American cultures as we go through our units in our course. And next time we'll be looking at Europeans and talking a little bit about what was going on there and how those groups were developing and what eventually led them to explore and to seek out new places, eventually finding this quite old world that becomes a new world to them.